Donald Tusk is likely to become the next Prime Minister of Poland, and as long-time fans of the Tusker on this podcast, we're very happy about that. The Law and Justice Party has installed crony judges, taken over the media, and is now talking about trying to rerun the election. But the US president who tried to cling to power after he was kicked out in 2020 now has a real chance of running again and winning. That's despite the many felony indictments hanging over him. What would a Trump rerun mean for Europe, Ukraine, and indeed the Middle East? Brian, you argue that America needs to take the threat of a Trump comeback much more seriously. Are Democrats burying their heads in the sand?
I think that pretty much every Democrat is aware this is a serious risk. You just look at the polls, and the polls show either Trump ahead or very, very close with Biden. And so, lots can change. It's a little over a year until the election. But at the moment, it's looking like a toss-up. And the point of view that I have is that this would be, I think, a watershed moment in the history of the modern world, as well as, a serious death spiral for American democracy. That is a realistic prospect. So it has to be taken really, really seriously. My worry is less with the Democrats themselves. It's more with how Trump is being portrayed in the media. And I wrote a piece a week ago, that coined this term called the banality of crazy. And it's sort of this notion that Trump's behavior has become so outlandish, but so routine that it no longer registers. And, after I wrote this piece criticizing the New York Times and other, American outlets for not covering some of Trump's rhetoric in which he, effectively, he called to execute America's top general. He called to shoot shoplifters on the spot without a trial, right, for minor crimes, to execute them. None of this got coverage. And yet, Joe Biden's dog biting a Secret Service agent had like hundreds of articles written about it in the US press. And so after I, wrote this criticism and it took off online and people started to write about it in other mainstream outlets, the New York Times did cover this on page 14, right? They wrote about the sort of incitement to violence. And this is the thing that I think is really dangerous, is that we have an asymmetry where, yes, Joe Biden is old. He absolutely is old. Trump is 3 years younger than him, but is also facing 91 felony indictments, was found liable for sexual abuse, incited an insurrection to overturn democracy, has been found recently to have committed mass fraud for self-enrichment, right? These are not parallel things. They're not equivalent. And so to my mind, you have, a really big obligation on the part of the media to explain the magnitude of the story, not just the novelty. And I fear that a lot of the press in America has focused on novelty, which is why Joe Biden's dog, becomes a story. And it's particularly ironic because the whole aspect of media criticism around this is that's saying that, we don't cover dog bites man, we cover man bites dog stories. And yet the story about Biden was literally a dog bites man story. So, it's a complete mess. And the stuff Trump is saying on Truth Social, take my word for it, don't subject yourself to this. But the stuff he's saying on his own social media site is so much crazier than what he said as president. It's so much more extreme. He is amplifying QAnon constantly, and this is not getting covered. Whereas in 2017, when he said something mildly weird, the BBC would call me to ask me about what had happened in US politics. This just doesn't happen anymore. It's just become baked in as part of the Trump equation.
Rachel, is Europe taking the prospect of a Trump comeback seriously?
I think it depends. What do you mean by take seriously? I think there is certainly real concern among European leaders that this is a realistic prospect in a way that there wasn't in 2016 when he was a joke candidate and foreign ministries across Europe weren't really taking that seriously. I think one of the things that we've all learned about Trump over the last decade is there's always a possibility and you should be prepared for it. But okay, you think it might happen. What does that mean? What does preparing for that mean in practice? Brian just talked about the possibility of the US withdrawing from NATO. What does that look like? There's no real way that the remaining members of NATO could overnight make up the shortfall in US funding, US influence, US power. What would it look like in terms of who would lead the alliance? There's no sort of clear answers there. Kind of what would it mean for Ukraine to have Europe, which has been very united against Putin's Russia, suddenly, okay, Trump pulls US aid from Ukraine, and perhaps says he's going to broker a deal between Putin and Ukraine, that puts Europe in an incredibly awkward position, and it's difficult to see a good option for how European leaders would react to that. And that's assuming that European leaders can agree with each other on what their reaction would be. I think we're already dealing with the consequences of US foreign policy during the first Trump term, which was pulling away from global institutions and global influence. And without getting too much into what's behind Putin's invasion of Russia, it's widely accepted that the US stepping back from global engagement during the Trump years was a factor in emboldening Putin. So I think the answer to that question is Europe is aware that it's a possibility, but there's a limit to what you can do to prepare for it.